Of course, today of all days had to be one of my shifts. Typical. Ella couldn't help but sigh. And why wouldn't she? This was the 4th time in a row this week that her shift had been on the day one of the hospital's patients was about to pass away, meaning that she had to deal with the ever-pleasant psychopomps, or soul guides that came to collect the patient's soul, as well as the grieving families. Both of which were the last thing she needed in her already stressful workday. Not helped by the fact that Miss Martins, the patient that was about to die, was not only the nicest patient, but also a human. So not only would the hospital genuinely be a worse place to work at with Miss Martins gone, but knowing her own luck, Ella wouldn't be surprised if Miss Martins' family tried to fight off the psychopomp or something. You never knew with humans. In the end, all she could do was wait and hope for the best. But of course, that didn't stop her from worrying, and her mind from wandering to the point that she only noticed that someone was standing in front of her counter when they said, "Excuse me, could you tell me where the room of my old friend, Miss Dorothy Martins, is?" Causing Ella to quickly look up, before freezing up in complete terror when she saw the skeleton wearing a black robe and holding a scythe in his right skeletal hand that was standing in front of her. It stared at her with 2 smouldering blue dots sitting in its empty eye sockets that effortlessly stared into her soul, and like a deer in the headlights of a car, she couldn't help but stare into them until the skeleton laid a calming hand on her shoulder and said, "Do not be afraid, my dear, I am not here for you, so take a deep breath and calm down." In a warm tone of voice that only Ella's grandfather had used to talk to her, causing odd memories of her sitting on her grandpa's lap while he told her all kinds of stories with that big goofy grin of his. Which calmed her down enough to take a few deep breaths before she stood up, grabbed a notepad she had prepared when she had first heard that she should expect a psychopomp, and then said, "Of course, sir, but may I have your name first?" As calmly as she could, and with an apologetic smile on her face, since she knew how much most psychopomps disliked to be kept waiting. But instead of being annoyed or even mad at the delay, the skeleton just chuckled a bit before it said, "Death, taxes, and paperwork are truly the 3 things you can't escape, aren't they? And to answer your question, pretty much everyone just refers to me as Death." In such a casual tone that Ella only really realized what he had actually said when she had written it down. And when she noticed, she stared at the name she had written down for a moment before slowly looking up and asked, You are deaf? Not a psychopomp?" A bit of the terror from just a moment ago slowly returning as she realized who she was talking to. "Yes, I am deaf, and I don't mean that metaphorically, rhetorically, poetically, theoretically, or any other fancy way. I am deaf, straight up, so I would appreciate it if we could go now. I am sadly a bit short on time." Causing Ella to quickly bow apologetically before she hurriedly walked out from behind her counter she had been sitting behind. Only to quickly bow once more before she said, "My apologies, sir, please follow me," and then began to hurriedly walk towards the room Miss Martins, as well as her family, were in right now, knowing that the spectre of death behind her could easily keep pace with her. Thankfully, the room wasn't that far away, so a few minutes later she stood in front of the room and then held the door of it open so that Death could enter, before she wrote down his time of arrival, then followed him inside. The inside of the small room was just as Spartan as every hospital room, in every realm across the galaxy seemed to be, with only the bed Miss Martins was laying on standing inside of it, against one of the walls. Her family was standing around the bed, too busy trying to talk with the exhausted old woman, who could barely keep her eyes open, to notice Ella and Death enter the room. Seeing this, Death placed his scythe against the nearest wall, and then reached inside his robe to pull out an hourglass before he said, "She doesn't have much time left," causing all the heads of the assembled Martins family to turn to look at him, at which point Ella expected them to shout or curse at him. But instead, Miss Martins' oldest son walked up to Death, gave him a big hug and said, "Welcome, old friend," before he introduced him to the rest of the family, though Ella had the feeling that Death already knew them. The other 3 adults hugged Death as well, though they were a bit awkward around him, but the 3 children were clearly a bit more wary of him, seeing as how they hid behind their parents from him. But then one of the 2 girls ran up to Death and pulled slightly on his robe to get his attention. Once she had it, she asked, Will Grandma go to heaven? Seemingly worried for her grandmother's well-being in the afterlife. Death looked at her for a moment, then kneeled down and patted her head before he said, Do not worry, my dear. I may know little of heaven or hell, but I do know your grandma very well, more than well enough, in fact, to say that her place in heaven is all but guaranteed. Then he stood up and walked towards the bed, where he pulled out the hourglass again. A bit more than 10 minutes left, and she is way too weak to even say goodbye. Oh dear, that certainly won't do, Dev said, before he reached into the old woman's chest with one of his skeletal hands, then lifted her up into the air with ease, before he placed her next to the bed on her own 2 feet. Or that's what Ella thought he did, but then she noticed there was another Miss Martin still laying in the bed that wore a hospital gown, while the one standing next to the bed wore the clothes Miss Martins had worn when she arrived in the hospital. Additionally, the Miss Martin standing next to the bed was ever so slightly translucent, making it clear to Ella that this was Miss Martin's soul that Death had pulled out of her body. This was the first time Ella had seen a soul like that. All others had been little floating spheres of light that could sometimes talk, but apparently human souls were just built different, probably thanks to the black energy that coursed through their veins and surrounded Miss Martin's soul like an aura. Anyways, Miss Martins just stood there completely asleep for a moment, before she opened her eyes and looked around, clearly confused about what had happened, until her gaze fell on Death, causing her eyes to widen in recognition. Then she calmly asked, Is it time? But Death shook his head in return and said, No, not yet. You still have enough time to say goodbye. Before he gestured towards her family, causing the old woman's head to turn towards them. Todd, did you lose weight? Miss Martins asked her oldest son as she walked towards him before hugging him. Her son chuckled a bit as he held his mother tightly to his chest and then said, Been a tough week, Mum. Sorry for worrying you, with tears in his eyes. I should be the one telling you that with how much I clearly made you worry, but nevertheless thank you, and I love you too. Never forget that. Before she let go of her son to pat him on his cheek. Then she walked towards his wife to hug her as well, before she told her, Look out for him for me, would you? You know how he is. Causing the woman to nod meekly as tears streamed down her face. Satisfied, Miss Martins let go, patted her on the shoulder, and then turned to her youngest son. Mum, I just wanted to apologize for being a stubborn ass of a son. I wanted to say this to you way sooner, but I just never found the right moment to do so. So seeing as this is the last time we will see each other for a while, I just wanted to say sorry for everything, the man said, his head lowered in shame, causing a tear to run down his mother's face as she nearly ran to him to hug him. And I apologize for being an equally stubborn old woman and that I never believed in you like your father, but know that I am very proud of you, Miss Martin said as she hugged her youngest son tightly, causing tears to run down the man's face as well as he hugged his mother back. I love you, Mum, he said after a moment, before he let go of his mother and gently pushed her towards his wife, who quickly embraced Miss Martins. This made Miss Martins smile warmly as she hugged her second daughter-in-law back and said, Thank you for all you have done for my son. Then after another moment she let go before she kneeled down, spread her arms and said, Come on, kids, give your granny one last hug, causing the children to almost throw themselves into her arms, nearly throwing the old woman off her feet, which made Ella wonder why the woman's soul was able to touch things, like it was corporeal. But before she could really think too deeply about it, Miss Martin said, Now, my dears, it was wonderful to see you again, but Granny has to go soon, so always remember that as long as you remember me, I shall always be with you, and that I love all of you. Before she tried to hug them again, but this time her arms went right through the children's bodies, causing Miss Martins to stare at her hands, the question of why she suddenly couldn't touch her grandchildren anymore, clearly visible on her face. I am afraid it is time to go, Dev said, as he walked up to Miss Martins as if to answer her question, and then offered her one of his skeletal hands to seemingly help her up, which the old woman gladly took. Then she and Dev linked arms and walked out of the room, followed by Miss Martin's family, while Ella waited until they had all left the room before she followed the silent procession to the main entrance of the hospital. Once Miss Martins and Deaf had reached the main entrance, the automatic doors opened, causing warm light as well as pure white smoke to gently spill into the room, making it hard to tell what was beyond the doors exactly. Though it was somewhat obvious that the doors didn't lead to the parking lot outside the hospital anymore. Anyways, once the doors were open, Miss Martin stared into the light for a moment before she turned around, waved her family goodbye, and then stepped through the door with Deaf. Then, when the doors closed behind them, both her and Deaf disappeared, just like the light as well as the fog, as if they had never been there. Which left Ella unsurprisingly with a lot of questions, so she walked up to Miss Martin's oldest son, since he was just staring at the door, unlike the rest of his family that tried to calm down the children, and asked, "Is this what always happens when you know one of your kind dies?" So quietly that only he could hear it. This caused the man to turn his head to stare at her for a moment with those green eyes, surrounded by a black void, obviously making Ella more nervous than she liked to admit, before he turned to look at the door again. "I don't know, kind of my first time as well, but I sure do hope so, even though I know that the chances of that are rather low, seeing how wild emotions tend to run in situations like that. However, I don't think it is rare either. What I do know, though, is what he does when somebody is about to die alone," he said after a moment, a smile spreading across his face as he spoke. "And what is that?" Ella asked, in the same excited whisper she had often used when her grandfather had told her stories. Which made the human turn his head once more to her before he said, "He stays with them till the end. Now I know this might not sound like anything special to you, but believe me, when you are in that situation, it is. Or at least it was to me when I nearly died," with a little shrug. Ella kinda just stared at him for a moment before she asked, "You nearly died once before?" somewhat shocked at how casually the human had said that. The human just smiled at her reaction and said, "Yup, I had a really nasty car accident a few years ago when I drove home from work because an animal had jumped on the road and I swerved to the side so much to avoid hitting the animal that I drove off the road straight into a tree with so much speed that the impact knocked me out. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came to, the car was totaled and blood was running into my eyes from a wound in my temple, which of course wasn't my only injury, seeing as I was in so much pain from just breathing and weak from the internal bleeding that even if the doors weren't broken, I probably couldn't have opened them. Despite that, I managed to grab my phone and call myself an ambulance, and with that done, I could do little more than wait for help to arrive, all alone with only the pain as well as the cold to keep me company. But that's when Death suddenly appeared in the passenger seat next to me and offered me a cigarette. As you can imagine, I was rather surprised by this, but for some reason I was weirdly calm, and to this day I don't know why I was so calm. Probably just had too little energy thanks to the blood loss, but who knows. Anyways, after just staring at the offered pack of cigarettes for a moment, I managed to ask if him being here meant that I was dead, which he just shook his head at before he told me that if I died or not today depended on if I could stay awake long enough for help to arrive, and that he was here just in case I did die, so that at least I wouldn't die alone. And when I asked him why he did this, he just told me that there are not that many people that truly deserve to die all alone, so he stays with them, so that they don't have to die alone. With that cleared up, I took one of the offered cigarettes, let him light it for me, and then we just sat there talking about nothing in particular until the ambulance arrived, at which point he disappeared. Completely casually, as if he was just telling her about a night out with a friend of his. Ella had to take a moment to digest what she had just been told, because she had never heard of a psychopomp, or even Death itself, acting like this, so she asked, "Why do you seem so familiar with Death, to the point that you refer to each other as old friends?" without really thinking. The human thought about that for a moment, then said, "Death is not a hunter, unbeknownst to its prey. One is always aware that it lies in wait." But this just confused Ella, so the human clarified. "You have to remember that our world is maybe the only world in the universe that was not created by a god, but by pure chance. Because of this, our world is unsurprisingly a lot more hostile than any other of the known worlds, and death is a far more common occurrence to the point that one could say that we know death from the moment we are born. So we kinda just got used to him, more than any other of the known species anyways, and that's also why we often call him an old friend." Which only left Ella with more questions, But before she could ask him any more questions, the man's younger brother appeared behind him, says something in a language Ella couldn't understand, which caused the older brother to turn to her once more and say, "It is time for us to leave as well. Thank you for everything, and have a good day." Then the humans left the hospital, leaving Ella alone with her thoughts, upon which she realized she had forgotten to fill out Miss Martin's paperwork, causing her to facepalm before she muttered to herself, "Shit, it really is one of those days, isn't it?"